Started. So last week on Thursday, we covered some ways in which we're going to collect feedback from customers, and then I explained how a lot of times the way to get more adoption is to take a look at who's already using your product and then doing case studies off of them. And then we also talked about some demand creation activities, how you can't just expect people to sign up, but you have to go out there, do some level of education in order to get the word out about your product. And then we did the exercise where all the groups presented their value proposition, and then we gave each other feedback based on the value proposition. So this week, before we get started, a couple announcements. Obviously, you all know that Lab 2 you're presenting this week. Just to be clear, there's obviously the write-up as well as the presentation, and all the points that I've listed have to be encapsulated in the combination of the write-up and the presentation. So if you are deciding, hey, it's only going to be a 5 or 10 minute presentation, we can't do everything, then I get it. I'm just going to be grading off of making sure that you've done all of what I've listed. The quiz, I've moved it to Thursday, so it'll be in the second half. Instead of doing an exercise like we normally do, we'll just have the reading quiz. And then I've also posted Lab 3, and next week I know it's fall break, but the week after that is week 9, where you'll be doing your Lab 3 presentation. So I'd encourage you to get started on that. The lab focus is basically paper prototyping, so you've got to create your prototype, and you've got to do the usability tests. There is a nuance. You're going to have to do one using Verify the tool, and then you're going to have to do a couple, in person with whomever your early adopters are. Actually, an amendment to this, I'm not going to have office hours next Wednesday either. Apparently, your fall break goes until then, so no point in me showing up. All right, I know a few of you have already signed up for the review session. I will get back to you on your dates and times. For those of you who haven't, yeah?
I don't know if it matters, but I think fall break goes to Tuesday. Yeah.
Oh,
Class
okay.
starts Wednesday.
Is that true, Dr. Glass?
I thought it went through Wednesdays. You back in class Wednesday. Oh, these guys would know better than me, for sure.
Okay.
I mean, we don't like
well,
that.
then I will have office hours on Wednesday. Okay, that's fine. Then I'll have it. Then it's what it is. I thought that was what I saw on the calendar too, but okay.
My fault. I mean, I don't think you should have class hours just because classes are back unless people want it.
Yeah.
Office hours. So does anybody think they're going to need office hours Wednesday? It's fine if you do. So don't.
Okay. Well, if you do, just ping me. I'm going to be here. If you need it for Lab 3, usually that's the case.
Yeah. Great.
Okay. And then a few of you have already signed up for your idea summaries, which is great, which means you're participating in the G-Startup Challenge. Those of you that haven't, I would hurry up and sign up so that you have a spot. And if you have, like I said, friends, family, whomever that's participating in this, they're welcome as well. All right. I don't know why this. Oh, okay. Okay. So today we're going to cover collecting feedback from customers, incorporating it into the product, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how you create some alignment on the team, because the direction we're moving into is now we're actually building the product, right? Whether it's a prototype, whether it's the actual physical or software or whatever it is that we're building, we now are moving in a path of actually developing a product. So we've got to get some alignment on the team. We also have to come up with a product roadmap, which is going to be your exercise towards the last portion of class today. And then we'll talk about how do you go about picking features to put them into a prototype or an MVP, right? A lot of times this is the confusion that people have. It's what do I even put in the first product? How do I figure that out? Okay, so, I've showed this a few times, and basically we're still in this phase of customer creation. Right? Even as we are developing our product, we've got to go out there, we've got to find customers, we've still got to validate that they like the product that we're building. But what we're doing now is we're moving from the customer discovery phase that we've been in for the last few weeks into this building process. Right? So that means we've done some usability tests and we have to create a product roadmap. And then once both of those are done to our satisfaction, then we can figure out, okay, what are we going to build? But a lot of what we're going to build comes down to this feasibility of resources. And by resources, I don't just mean money. I also mean time and your knowledge base. Because oftentimes there might be something that you ultimately want to build, but you just don't have the capacity or the talent on the team today to build it. So we've got to figure out all of those things as we're putting together our roadmap and before we can actually build the product. So we've talked a little bit about what a Concierge MVP is, right? We talked about that last week. What's a Concierge MVP? Not the question here, I know, but who remembers?
You just do everything kind of like for the customer. You meet one-on-one instead of like automating, and then you do whatever they need.
Yeah, so it's basically just an experience. The experience is the product that you're giving them. So, you know, an MVP is still partly can be concierge, but a lot of times people do just, if they can, build an interactive product for the customer. So when we ask the question, what is an MVP, it's still testing the value proposition and the early adopter, right? Your choice to create it as a concierge style with an experience versus an actual product, that's up to you. The only reason I throw it out is because a lot of times people who aren't technical can benefit from building out a concierge MVP first, rather than having to scramble and get resources to hire a developer or engineer or whatnot. So, in this phase, when we're talking about purely product development, we've got 3 things that we have to do, right? So we've already done one of them, and you'll continue to do it for your lab 3, which is creating wireframes, right, and doing some usability testing, collecting feedback, and then using that to create stories. And of course, stories are what then gets fed into features and gets built, right? So that's where we're going to start. And the other thing I want you to keep in mind is that there are stages of usability testing. We've talked about this a little bit before, where we start with paper prototypes, then we do some interaction, then we do what's called high-fidelity mock-ups, and then we've got a final prototype that we're putting out. So there are 4 steps. It's not just, you know, one step and then you're done. A lot of times in the paper prototype itself, you might have to go back and refine what you're building. Customers might be confused. Or you might, you know, get all the way to the end where they say, hey, this isn't really what I wanted, and then you've got to go back, you know, a couple steps or possibly all the steps. So realize that there are steps within this process and use them to your advantage because it's going to help, you know, actually help you get traction on your product. So for those of you who are wondering what high fidelity mockup is, it's basically just, you know, something in Photoshop. You have the colors in place here. Here's an example. When we did this, people thought the yellow buttons were PayPal buttons, so that was confusing. So we had to go back and change the color scheme, right? But we do this as sort of a later phase before we build out the product. So keep that in mind too. You're always testing for multiple parameters. It's not just, hey, they agreed to the paper, we're good to go. So the second phase is obviously building a product roadmap. And the reason that this product roadmap is crucial, you know, it can seem a little bit laborious to build it, but the reason it's crucial is because this is the phase where you're going to be aligning your business goals with what it is that you're building. Now, this is a major reason why you, in those initial customer interviews, in your market research phase, you've got to make sure that the product that you're building and the features that you're building are actually going to meet certain, you know, pain points or give you certain opportunities with the customer. Because if it's not, then you're not meeting your business goals. Okay? And this is, once again, why we have to set up what our hypothesis is for the goals that we have. So we'll get into what I mean by that. So the first is the product roadmap actually gives you a level of vision. Okay? It means you know what's coming in the future. And the other thing, which I've mentioned before, is that a lot of times people don't want to participate, other teammates don't want to participate if they don't know where you're headed, right? So having a product roadmap gives people a little bit more insight into where you're headed. Doesn't mean you have to stick to that forever, but you've at least got a sense of where you're going next, or you could be going next. So before we get into what the product roadmap is, we have to think about sort of the 3 groups here that we have to appeal to as we build the product roadmap. So the first, obviously, are customers, right? What in our roadmap is going to convey that clear product and value proposition right when we launch the prototype? Right? The second is, how are we going to keep the teammates motivated, helping them grow? Are they going to be personally invested in building infrastructure that might not be that exciting to them initially, but it's got to get done, right? And then the third is for the stakeholders, whether you have investment or whether it's yourself or whomever, what's the ROI that they're getting in terms of this first product that you're putting out, in terms of the MVP you're putting out. So let's start with the team. So the first thing we have to think about before we get into the product roadmap and showing the employees what it is, they have to first develop a sense of empathy for the customer. We've talked about this a lot in our earlier lectures about team management, but I'm pulling it back in here just so that you understand the importance, and I'm driving the point home. And so part of having empathy means that they should have participated in usability tests. They should understand who your customers are. They should understand the direction you're headed in. Right? The second is that you have created priorities in your product. This is why you went through and you created stories. You made sure there wasn't scope creep, and you now know, what's going to come first, also based off of some business goals. So a simple example of that is with Feasibility. Our product priorities are, no matter what we build, whether it's big or small, it's got to be simple, and the UI must be consistent. And if those two things aren't met, then we're not going to ship it. It's not a good feature, and we can just kick ourselves. So we have to sort of put out these guidelines for our teammates to understand why we're prioritizing things the way they are, right? A lot of times, developers or engineers or other teammates will be like, why are we doing this again, right? Why is this on the product roadmap? What's of importance? So you have to set up some principles and some priorities of what's important. Why are we doing, these certain things first? Now, the third thing, which I've talked about previously as well, is time to learn, right? Not everybody's going to come up to speed immediately. They're not going to understand the customer. They're not going to understand why the product is heading in the direction it's heading in initially. They need some time to understand all of those things. So, bake that into your product roadmap. And then the final is that you're going to have to set some goals, right? What is it that your business goals are in your product roadmap? It's not enough to say, hey, we want to get a bunch of customers. Do you have a specific number of customers? Do you have a type of customer? Are you trying to figure out, sign-ups versus engagement or monetization, right? What are all the different things that you're thinking about? So some common business goals that people come up with are, like I said, customer acquisition, right? By acquisition, I don't mean paid acquisition. I just mean how many people are going to sign up and participate. You could certainly consider paid acquisition, or rather people paying you. That's up to you. But a lot of times we just say how many people are going to participate. Then a second possible business goal would be how many people do we want to retain, or do we care about retention in this first iteration? Maybe we don't. Maybe we just want to get feedback first and see if they even found any value in it before they're going to use it a second time. And then a third example would be monetization. So what's the goal? How much money do we expect to make off of this first iteration? So you want to think about these three things as you create your roadmap. And this will give you an idea of what the roadmap is going to look like. So, this is just a simple example. Years can be more complicated. There can be more rows and columns and all of that. But the approach that I've always taken is, dates at the top, or potential dates. Note that a lot of these deadlines will change depending on the complexity of what you're building. But then you list, what the feature is. You're not going to list the stories. You're just going to list the high-level feature. And then you're going to list what the business benefit is. Okay? So here we've got, well, we're going to do something that's going to help with retention and re-engagement. We're going to do something that's a new source of revenue based off of transactions when we include this payment gateway. Or we're going to go after a new customer segment. We're going to do larger studios. Okay? So laying something out like this, does a few things, right? The first is now everybody knows where you're headed. The second is they know why you're headed in this direction, right? You can very clearly point to an engineer and say, look, the reason you're working on this annoying payment gateway integration is because it's going to bring us a lot of money. So while it might not be exciting to you, and there's things that are coming that are probably more exciting, we need you to get this piece done. Is this starting to make sense? So a lot of times people don't take the time to lay something out like this, where every team can understand what it is that they need to accomplish, and also see how their piece fits in to the larger puzzle, right? That's what people care about. That's how products ship on time and teams stay cohesive, because they see, okay, we understand what marketing needs to do here. We understand what engineering needs to do here. But everybody sees their piece. It's not just, hey, engineering, go build these 5 features. Okay? So actually what would happen is, I left this out, but you could also have marketing in here where you say, hey, we're going to have a PR announcement, or we're going to have a trade show, or we're going to do some event, right? You could layer on top of this as you are hitting your dates. And then, of course, the converse is true. As you don't meet your dates, you're going to have to change everything up as well. Does this make sense to people? Has anybody seen this before? Okay, so this is new. That's good. Any questions on this? So the last piece, which I didn't mention, is the top 3. Right? You classify projects. You classify what's infrastructure. We've talked about this before, right? This is the scope creep. These are the stories that creep up that take a lot of time. So what do you need to put in that's infrastructure that has to happen before you can even innovate, before you can build the new features? And then, of course, the third being, customers are requesting this. So clearly there's a pull, right? So you kind of have to classify the 3 things that you're building. And eventually what happens as you get into multi-year projects is you'll have some level of balance between these 3, right? You'll have some infrastructure projects, like you might have to scale your infrastructure to account for the fact that you're growing at like 10%, so you've just got to handle that many new customers. You might want to put new features out to attract more because you care about growth. And then you might have some folks who are threatening to leave, or you just want to keep them around longer, so you want to satisfy some of their requests. So you've got to balance all of these 3 things. But at the get-go, don't worry about doing all these 3 things. A lot of times, it's just the first 2. And even in the first 2, the second one, the new features, is going to be really minor, right? It's going to be the features that are going to make a big impact, solve a pain, get the early adopters on board. Okay, so we've already talked about most of this, but there's 2 more things here. So obviously, this roadmap conveys the vision, and you can dig into the feature and dig into the story. But the other 3 things that are important are, it helps you anticipate delays, right? So if you think that, hey, I'm not going to be able to build this payment gateway integration by 2011, well, then everything else is going to be pushed out, right? So it gives you a good sense of, what we're going to have to push. The other thing is you might want to layer accelerators. So in the event that you get funding, or in the event that you have some high growth, you now have additional capital, possibly resources, to do some additional projects, right? So then you might say, hey, we need to hire more staff, or hey, we didn't get the money, we've got to downsize. So you can always go back to that roadmap. But the biggest is now you've tied in the business goals. So now you know what it is you're measuring as you put each of these features out, as you allocate resources, and as you, once again, figure out what the timeline is for all of that. Okay? So now that you've done this, right, it's not going to be so easy to just say, hey, here's the roadmap, let's all get to work, right? There's obviously going to be some level of hesitation. People are going to be like, well, I don't know if we should go in that direction, or, I don't really like that we're working on this feature before this feature first, because my customer interactions seem to skew, towards this, right? So there's going to be a difference of opinion. Or you might have an investor that's like, yeah, I think you guys should really be doing this other thing, not this. So you're going to have to deal with some level of pushback and getting buy-in, right? Even from your own teammates. So just like you want to deal with objections that your customers give you, right, as they're saying, hey, we don't like this price point, or we don't like this feature, etc., you're also going to want to deal with the team's objections before you build. Okay, so if somebody says, hey, I don't think this is a good idea, or no, this is actually going to take 5 months, not 1 week, you might want to actually dig into those objections and deal with them, because otherwise it's just going to derail everything farther down the pipeline. Okay? So this comes back again to the team and what you need to do with your team. So obviously you want to deal with the pushback. And the way to do it is to first understand where it's coming from, right? Are they pushing back because they have some reasons, or are they just being, annoying? Right? Think about that. Well, sometimes people are just like, they just want to be difficult. And then make sure, even if you get pushback, you bring it back to the vision, right? Why are we doing this again? What's the purpose of what we're building? Or at least what's our short-term vision versus our long-term? And then one of the things that I like to do, which a lot of people don't do because they're just on this freight train, is I like to, every time we do a release, meaning we put a product or a feature out in front of a customer, I like to go back and then not only take the feedback from customers, but the feedback from the team, right? Because a lot of times people are working on a long stretch. It could be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. But give them an opportunity to say, hey, what worked here and what didn't? not just what the customers liked and what they didn't, but what's a process improvement that we can put in place, right? What maybe didn't work so well. And this gives people a forum where they can be heard, hopefully. And typically the way that I like to run postmortems is I say everybody has to come in with like 3 positives and 3 negatives. And we kind of look at all the negatives to see what's a common negative, and maybe we pick one to improve upon before the next postmortem. And in the next postmortem, we have to see, what worked and what didn't based on that negative, right? But what we're trying to do is we're not trying to get rid of all the negatives, but we're trying to, hopefully address some of the negatives so that they're not impacting as we, grow the business. Does that make sense? So yeah, this is a very powerful meeting that you should get used to. Maybe we'll have a practice session after you guys have done a couple labs where you can do a postmortem and see how it turns out. And then the final is obviously acknowledge and appreciate your teammates if they pulled an all-nighter. Hopefully you don't need to do that for any of these labs. But if somebody's really gone out of their way, or if it was group effort, take the time to recognize. So, assuming that goes all well, you've got your alignment, right? But sometimes you might not have the alignment that you need, and you might be stuck in a stalemate. So, in the event that that happens, right, understand why they're pushing back, right? What is it that they are unhappy with? Is it that, hey, we just had 3 releases, or like 3 all-nighters, or, what's the deal? Why is it that people are unhappy? And let's deal with it, right? The second is, are you changing too much behavior? In those postmortems, are you saying, hey, we've got 20 negatives, we've got to fix them all, right? And then people are like, what the hell? Like, this is too much for us to deal with. On top of that, we're also, building a lot, right? So think about how much change of behavior you're inflicting on the team as you're building your product. And then, can you do some small sales, right? Can you say, hey, okay, we're not going to pull an all-nighter this month. We're all going to get a good night rest. And maybe our deadline slips by a week as a result, but we're okay with that, not a big deal. And then the final is having some checkpoints, right? So having these postmortems, having consistent communication, and also, mentioned this many times, mentioning it again, is have a way to resolve conflict, right? Somebody gets upset, either the deadline wasn't met, or a customer's unhappy, or they're just tired, right? How are you going to resolve these issues as they come up? And the reason I bring these up is because more than, I think, 99% of the time where products don't ship is not because people can't build. It's because of all of this stuff, right? This is where a lot of the hang-up happens. Okay, so assuming everything goes well, right, how do you want to create your team? So typical teams will have, and this is, mind you, the example is for a software or hardware project. So you're going to have one person who's the designer, right? They're the ones that are going to be doing the wireframes, the high-fidelity mock-ups. Typically, they're also the ones that are going to be doing the majority of the usability tests. But I always encourage at least one engineer or developer to go to a couple of them to develop some empathy. And they're also going to, combined with the product manager, do some level of customer discovery as well. Now, of course, the developer is going to think more about, okay, now that I've got the business goals and the product lifecycle, how feasible is it given the amount of time and the resources and the team that I have? And what does the functionality look like? And then when you think about more specifics, it's the designer's going to create the high fidelity mock-ups, do the they might write some code depending on their talents. But the developer is going to be the one that's building the majority of the functionality. And for the product manager, they're going to sit down and figure out how to prioritize the stories. They might do the wireframes, do the usability test, so they'll hand some of that off to the developer. But the important thing is, these 3 roles, you might find meshes, especially in a young team where people are wearing many hats. But the key thing is to recognize that all of these pieces are necessary and to figure out who's going to take, not necessarily ownership in like a strict sense, but who's going to get them done, right? Because sometimes people will argue over ownership and, well, this is my project, like I'm the one that does wireframes. It's like, okay, let's figure out a way that things just get done and people aren't stepping on each other's toes. So, The reason I bring this up is because sometimes you can have a bit of a flow that's not so nice. Meaning, the designer might be taking a lot of time to create something spectacular. Meanwhile, the developer's like sitting there twiddling their thumbs, wondering, hey, when am I going to get something to build, right? And so you want to design a workflow that flows between these three segments, or at least between these two segments, where people feel like they're being productive, right? So as the job of a product manager or whomever is responsible for managing these teams, they're going to want to figure out how to split up the workload. And you are all going to have to figure that too, unless you're all doing the work together. But you might want to decide, hey, so-and-so is going to do all the usability tests, and so-and-so is going to design them, or how we're going to divvy that up. OK, so when we talk about choosing goals for MVP, right, it's not that you have to do acquisition, monetization, and all the things that I listed. Right? You could have something different. Your goal could be, hey, we want to see if we can get 50 people to sign up, or we want to see if we can get $50, right? That might be a goal for you. It's up to you to figure out what your goals are for your MVP. And so the reason I say this is because a lot of times, depending on what your goal is, the rest of your process is going to be affected, right? So if you say something like, hey, we just care about getting 50 people to sign up, and if we don't get 50 people to sign up, then maybe we have to go back and redo our product. So then we've got to think about what the process is for that. If instead it's, hey, we've got to make sure we get $50, maybe $1 from each person, then we've got to establish a process for collecting the money. We've got to put that into the product. We might have to establish a way to get feedback on why people paid versus they didn't pay, right? So there's a lot of other processes that have to go in to validating whether or not that goal was met. So, the one thing I will say is, as you're thinking about these three roles, and like I said, this doesn't have to be hermetically sealed in any way. Think about not only how the workflow is going to be, but think about how they're going to come back and be affected by the goals, right? So, in the event that the design doesn't work, well, the designer is going to need to receive some feedback. They're going to need to do some iteration. And then based off of that, they're going to hand it off to a developer.
Do you mean exactly that decoupled from the design?
So a lot of times what happens, like I said before, is a developer will just be like, hey, I can't design anything because I don't know what it looks like. So until the designer gets back to me with a high-fidelity mock-up or a wireframe, there's nothing for me to build. So you've got to figure out some way that this person can stay productive, whether it's infrastructure projects, whether it's getting out and collecting feedback, whether it's going and learning a new programming language, whatever that is, right? But just so that they don't feel like they're stuck. And you kind of want to make the workflow in such a way that there's some level of handoff, right? Like, for example, marketing can't put together a marketing campaign unless they know what's going to be built, right? Who's the customer and all of that. That's a hold up for them. But once they know, they can go ahead. So that's why I say here, figure out a way to orchestrate smaller handoffs. Okay, so coming back here, right, we talked about move from customer discovery to usability testing, and given what's feasible, right? So let's talk about feasibility of resources. So the first thing is, obviously, as we're thinking about doing these postmortems, a lot of times people will say, look, this isn't feasible, or this wasn't feasible, and we did it, but clearly, here's the end result. The product isn't good, customers aren't happy, or our process is really messed up, we're just pulling all-nighters all the time. So make sure that whatever your process is, right, it's reflected in the postmortem, you're getting that feedback, and you're iterating on it. So it's not just enough that you've got this feedback mechanism for building, you also want to have a feedback mechanism for the process itself of how you're building, right? So there's just a little loop here between build, measure, and release. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but we'll get into it a little bit more. So when I talk about the postmortem, this is not also the time to be overly sensitive. Okay, so when I say people have to come in with pros and cons, a lot of times people will come in and then play the blame game. So that's not what we want to do, because that's not the goal. The goal is to improve the process and the goal is to meet the business goals that we've set out, right? So think about how you're going to structure your postmortems. The other thing, like I said before, is pick just a couple of things to focus on as once people have listed their pros and cons, and then you can always revisit it. But the big thing in making this meeting move slowly is everybody has to take a turn so that they get heard. It's not just one person running the entire meeting. So your team will also, like I said before, need to iterate on their process, on their communication. It's not going to be perfect from the beginning. All right, so let's talk about the last piece here, right? Now, hopefully, we've established a process for how the team's going to build, how they're going to communicate, and now we've got to figure out what it is that we're going to build, right? We've hopefully gotten the product roadmap down, but we need to do one final sanity check. So before we do that final sanity check, though, we have to think about, okay, before we ship, we have to set some expectations for early adopters on what the product's going to be, right? Is it going to be a Concierge MVP? Is it going to be a mobile app? Is it going to be a web app? Where are they going to be able to get it from? We might also want to track some usage. Okay, we want to see if they're actually coming and signing up, or if they're coming back frequently, or if they're not coming back. And the third is we have to have a mechanism to actually collect feedback, right? It's not enough that we put this out there, we've got to collect that. So only after we've done that can we move into this phase 2 of, hey, let's actually validate the MVP, let's build it, and let's continue to communicate with customers. And then the third is, based on what we hear, we might have to do some iteration, right? So this is just what do we need, what's the pre-work, what's the MVP work, and then what's the post-work. So I would encourage you, as you're building out the MVP, go back to the initial interviews, right? Always go back to that, right? What did they say was a pain point? What did they mention was really important to them? Sometimes that doesn't come out in usability tests, because in usability tests, we get back into product land, right? They're like, oh, they didn't like this button, or they didn't like this workflow, or they didn't like that it was pink versus blue. But that doesn't really answer the question of what was the most important thing that had to be built. So that's why I always say go back to those initial interviews to find that out before you get too hung up on the specifics of the product itself. Okay, and the reason I say that is because a lot of times your differentiation is going to be based off of what they told you in the interview. Right? So in the interview itself, they would have told you about, well, I really care about customer service, and the competitor's customer service really sucks, right? Or, I am not going to switch from the competitor over to you because, well, you're not building the features that I want, or maybe you are, right? So think about that. Or maybe the competitor has caused some problem that, remember we talked about point tool versus an integrated solution? So you might be able to build a point tool, one solution, not the entire solution that's going to displace the competitor, but a piece of it. So think back to how you're going to differentiate yourself. And then the final piece, which a lot of people, once again, don't think about, is the onboarding process, right? What's that experience going to be like? How are they going to actually go and sign up for this product? What's their first-time experience going to be like, right? It's not enough that you just have a couple features. This first-time experience really makes a difference. So when you're thinking about the MVP, it's going to basically have these 3 pieces. You're going to need to look at the needs that were exposed in the interview. You're going to obviously take the feedback from the paper prototype. And then, once again, the feedback from the wireframes, the interactions, or high fidelity that you've done. You're going to condense it all into, hey, this is what we're building first. This is our value proposition, and it's reflected by these 1 or 2 features. So, at this stage, hopefully, you've talked to your early adopters now, 3-4 times, like the same person. So you should know them pretty well. And you should also be able to know what their acute needs are, right? So it's not just, this is our early adopter, this is, hey, I really understand what their pain is, and I'm designing for that. But a lot of times what will happen is, you might not be able to build for that pain, right? You might just not have the resources, or the time, or the money, or it's more complex than you thought. So you can only build a piece of it, right? Now that's still okay. A lot of times people feel like the MVP has to solve, world hunger. It doesn't. Maybe theirs does. But But the key thing here is, can you get to solving one piece of it, right? So that might be a metric for you as well, is, hey, we're not going to solve the whole thing, maybe we're going to solve one piece. We know there's more that we need to build in order to be a comprehensive solution, but is there one part of the grander problem that we can get started with? Does this make sense? Okay. So, still, make sure that you are solving a pressing need, that you have identified the value proposition, and that your customers understand that value proposition, and obviously that you are different from your competition. Okay, so coming back now to the stories, right? We talked about this a little bit before, but I'm putting this back up here, mainly because we've already covered the first 4, but what I want to talk about is the last one, which is you're obviously going to have to do some internal testing, right? This isn't just like, hey, we built it and we can ship it. We're going to have to do some internal testing, and then we're going to obviously ship the product, and then we're going to test with the early adopters and collect their feedback. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind too. It's not just a done deal. And a lot of times we'll forget this first step because they're just so eager to launch it, right? Now, in this first step, don't go down the path of it's not perfect, therefore we can't launch, because a lot of times that will be an issue as well. So you're going to have to prioritize what's a showstopper versus, hey, we can ship this. It's okay that it's not 100% perfect.